Greetings, everybody. Welcome to our first plenary of Living Liberation. For those of you who are just now joining us, welcome, welcome, welcome. We are so excited to have you. For those of you who've been here for the morning, welcome. Yes, we are in this thing. We have a great panel coming up for you all. It's building liberatory organizations from the ground up. And your moderator for this panel is going to be the Chinyere Tutashinda. She is the executive director for the Center for Third World Organizing. In 2014, she co-founded the group Blackout Collective. In 2015, she joined the leadership body of the Movement for Black Lives and has worked since then to help build up the leadership and structure of Movement for Black Lives, as well as the Rising Majority, and continues to be in the work in different ways and inventive ways and figure out how to push us closer to liberation. She is also one of the founding members of the Liberatory Leadership Partnership, which is the body that holds this work. And so I'm going to pass that over to Chinyere Tutashinda so we can get into this good conversation.
Thank you so much, Karishi. Hello, good morning, good afternoon again. My name is Chinyere. I am very excited and honored to be joined by three amazing humans who have shaped, transformed, and really not only just built organizations, but large liberatory formations that are shaping and helping to transform the world that we live in, right? So we have today with us Cindy Wisner, who is a co-founder from Grassroots Global Justice. We have Tenjiwe McHarris, the co-founder of Blackbird and senior architect at the Movement for Black Lives. We also have Blue Lewis, who is a co-founder of NC Block. So we're just gonna jump right in. Cindy, can you please tell us a little bit? I know you are a 30-year veteran. You've not only helped start Grassroots Global Justice, but have been a part of many, many movement building formations and organizations. But if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, but also the history and origin of the organizations and formations you started, and really what makes them liberatory, not just in the work that we're doing externally, but in the internal workings of the organization.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody who has joined us here, to my fellow compañeras here on this panel. Want to first start off with just really thanking you, Chinyere, but thanking also C2, the Liberatory Leadership Partnership, Leadership Learning Community, Social Insights, and the Robert Sterling Clark Foundation for having this conversation and talking about how we live liberation and embody that freedom and honor our work and live our values. And so I want to just start off with sharing a little bit about a little bit about me, but also a little bit about Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. I come out of actually being trained by the Center for Third World Organizing as a community-based organizer, and early on in the mid 90s, when I was a MAP intern, I was really clear that I wanted to learn how to base build, right? I wanted to learn how to build fighting organizations to deal with the conditions that my family, that people I love, communities I care about in this country and this territory, that we needed to be able to be in formation with each other, to be able to address the things that we were being impacted by. And I started off I was also trained as a union organizer and helped build both independent worker centers and also, different formations along the way in the last 30 years, from national alliances to also international formations and hemispheric also networks. And have also been part of revolutionary formations. And so in a lot of ways, if I think about my last 30 years in organizing, a lot of it has been about building different types of organizations. And each of those organizations has a different purpose, has a different function, has a different role. But I think that they've been all important in the bigger sort of ecosystem that is necessary when we think about transformation that is needed, the systemic transformation that is needed in this country and territory. I want to share with you all, about 17 years ago, I was a member of Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. I worked at the Miami Worker Center, and I first came into contact with the Alliance as a member. And we actually were attending the World Social Forum that was happening in Venezuela. And I went with one of our member leaders, Miss Yvonne Stratford, from the Miami Worker Center. And we went on this delegation to participate representing US grassroots, what we call the grassroots organizing sector, and to be able to be there, to be able to exchange with our counterparts, right? Folks doing organizing work around housing, folks doing land defense, feminists, young people, radical trade unionists. And one of the things that I think for me was very pivotal in that experience, and this is part of the story of GGJ, the kind of DNA of GGJ, is that we were born out of this global and alter globalization movement, right? That really saw that another world was not only possible, but necessary, and that we needed formations and organizations to be built to fight and combat the systems that we were we were fighting against and are fighting against continually. And this is a place where we met with organizations, local organizations, national organizations, folks like the Movimiento Sin Tierra, right? The landless people's movements, that were then part of bigger formations like La Via Campesina, which is a 200 million families of campesinos, campesinas, peasants formations. And I remember coming back to the US and saying, wow, like that one, it was inspiring. It was phenomenal, changed my life. I took, sort of the red pill while I was there. And at the same time, I really felt like, how do we aggregate our power? Because the work that we were doing on the ground in Liberty City, in Wynwood, in South Florida was so critical and important. But how were we able to begin to take that strength and take that articulation and have it be something bigger, right? And have that impact, not only at a state-based level, but at a national level, but also at an international level. And so part of that for me is that Grassroots Global Justice Alliance is a membership-based alliance that is multiracial, it's multi-sectoral, it's intergenerational. It works in different territories here, not only in the US, but different territories in the US, from Guam to Puerto Rico to Hawaii to Alaska. And it's about being able to come together, bringing together our fights against militarization, not only the wars that the US wages on peoples all over the world and occupations of people's lands and self-determination, but also the wars in our community, right? The state violence against our communities, from the police to immigration, to connecting the work around environmental and climate justice, and dealing with really being able to deal with the impacts of the fossil fuel industry and economy on frontline and fence line communities. and being able to provide an alternative, in which we call just transition, right? A just transition out of that extractive model into a regenerative model. And then the third piece that's been important and has been strengthened in the last period is really around grassroots feminisms, and really talking about the importance of us having an anti-patriarchal, anti-racist perspective, not only to our work, but how we understand that ultimately, this system is based on racial and gendered capitalism and imperialism, and that there is a particular role that patriarchy and fundamentalism plays in the oppression of peoples, and particular women and gender non-conforming peoples, that I think is really important to name and fight against, right? And especially in the era of global authoritarianism, is really important to name. So part of the purpose of GGJ was to begin to articulate how we come together as the grassroots organizing sector with a perspective, a left agenda and a left perspective, but also being clear that we needed to be building a bridge between our struggles here in the US and these territories with our global brothers and sisters and kinfolk at an international level. That it wasn't enough to just be in solidarity, but that we needed to actually be in joint strategy with each other. Because if we understood racial and gendered capitalism as the issue, it goes beyond borders, right? It operates on a global level. It has manifestations and impacts and everywhere, and often worse in other places because of US government and US policy. So I think that that's one of the pieces that for us was really key and important as we started GGJ as an alliance, was to be clear that our work was a dual responsibility of being able to build and strengthen and aggregate our power here in the US and its territories, and but also be a vehicle to being able to make those, those connections, but actually develop joint strategy and practice with an internationalist lens and practice. I think I think that if I have a minute, the last thing I'll say is that, for us, it's clear that, I could talk about this more, but I'll leave it here. It's like, we're trying to build a transformative organizing model, right? That actually is clear about what the root causes of the problems are in our lives, but also how we then choose to then organize and towards what. And I think that's important, especially when we talk about the dominant model of organizing here in the US that's been Alinsky, it's been reformist, it's actually been something that has been anti-intellectual, it's been, it's been all of these things. And I think I could speak more to this as in the dialogue, but and with you all in the audience, that I think it's important to name that what we're trying to do and build is something very different and alternative to what currently exists.
Thank you for that, Cindy. Yes, I'm excited to dig a little bit into that last part and learning more about how that lives in the organization. So we'll definitely come back to that one. Next, I want to introduce Thenjiwe McHarris. Thenjiwe is a powerhouse movement builder who has over 15 years of experience, both domestically and internationally, and has really been a part of building movement infrastructure. So Thenji, can you please tell us a little bit about kind of how you got to that work, and then the building of just Blackbird, but then some of the larger movement infrastructure projects you've been about, and what has made it transformative, like really living into liberatory values, and what hasn't? Like, what would you say is actually not that?
Great, thank you. Can y'all hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Hey everyone, thank you for that, Chinyere. Also really honored and blessed to be on a panel with two comrades and you facilitating, Chinyere, that I have so much love and respect and admiration for. So great honor. And then to speak about something that is important, which is the project of advancing liberation takes people, and it takes organized people and containers that we build to hold both the work and them. So excited to talk about it. And I'll just start by saying it's always important for me, and I offer a lot of these thoughts humbly, and these are questions that I'm always thinking about. But historically, so many of our people, elders, ancestors, communities, have engaged in the project of organizing people in order to advance the project of liberation. And part of that has been to build infrastructure in order to hold the work that they were doing, but also to in some ways, to also hold the people doing the work over time. And so really, we've always been, as a people who are thinking about liberation, who are thinking about like structural transformation, have always thought about the how of it, and the building of the organizations is deeply connected to the how. And obviously, there's central to that is and what that is, what sort of encompasses everything is strategy, but the building of the organizations is how. So. And it's taken different shapes over time, and it's taken different forms over time. And I name that because the characteristics that we're seeing over the past probably like several decades, mostly emerging out of the around the 1980s until now, it's taken a different form, is really based on context and strategy. And so the context in which liberatory organizations were built decades ago, or those of our ancestors, took one shape. And I think what we're seeing is the proliferation and the experimentation of liberatory organization building in this moment, which within it has both a lot of great possibilities, but also challenges that I think that we have to contend with. And so as I go into sort of what is liberatory organization mean, and then also to talk about Blackbird and different movement infrastructures, you know, in thinking about the context that we're building organizations in now, we are dealing with a convergence of multiple different crises. And when we talk about crises, we talk about so many different things, but really what they are is a symptom and a byproduct of the crisis of capitalism that continues to force us into crisis after crisis, in conjunction with what's happening in terms of the climate crisis and what's happening. And as folks have shared at a conference that Grassroots Global Justice had recently, the crisis of empire, but also the crisis of legitimacy. And so what we're seeing happening in the world is people sort of bearing the weight and living within a context of an economic crisis and crises, and really the crisis of racial capitalism. What we're seeing is also what's happening just in terms of our actual planet and Earth, and what that means to us, both in terms of everyday harms, but also generationally. And then also what we're seeing happening essentially with nation states around the world, both in terms of how that's playing out globally, but then also there's also this like ballooning of crisis of legitimacy, where we see millions, not billions of people around the world really questioning legitimacy of the status quo. So that's all happening, and then again forces us into so many different realities we have to contend with. And so when we think about an actual organization that is liberatory, what that means for me is it's an organization that both has to contend with the material conditions of our people. And so whether or not you are engaging directly with it, or you are responding or advocating or trying to achieve transformative justice or structural change to address the material conditions of our people, it one has to contend with essentially that our people are, so many people around the world are suffering because of the crises that we're living in the context that I shared earlier. And in addition to that, it's also dealing with the structural realities that contribute to that suffering. And so for me, liberatory organizations contend with both of these, and in various different ways. And a lot of the organizations that I've been a part of, and Blackbird in particular, was born out of a moment in 2014, where it was looking at essentially this ongoing threat to Black life, that took in terms of violence to Black life, whether it was state violence, but other forms of violence to Black life, economic violence, various different forms of violence, and really thinking about the continuous suffering, but also thinking about what what are interventions that could be made in this moment that could actually address the structural realities that contribute to the violence, ongoing violence to Black life. And we were born out of that moment. And really for us, it was about the question of, can we build a container that would cultivate Black radical thinking and both be able to respond to make political interventions in particular moments, but also cultivate strategy and thought about what are these moments mean to the long arc of liberation for Black people in particular. And so Blackbird was designed to be a very small team to think about those questions. And then the way it took shape in our organization was one about, for us, it was about movement infrastructure. So as Cindy said earlier, we thought a lot about what does it mean to aggregate power? What does it mean to essentially challenge sort of hyper-individualism that also can take shape in organizations and move towards collectivism in terms of building the process of movement infrastructure, not just for shared clarity, but that we can drive strategy together. The second is around political interventions, rapid political interventions. How can moments like this actually contribute to the long arc of change and liberation for our people? And then the third is sort of, how are we essentially reaching the masses of folks who are maybe not engaged in political activity, but asking themselves questions about the moment that they find themselves in, and how are we essentially engaging in the project of building narrative power, storytelling, and narrative change. And so we were a small team that was born out of that. And through Blackbird, I've been able to be part of really, I think, powerful in deep partnership with folks like Blue and Chinyere in terms of the Movement for Black Lives, or the Rising Majority with Cindy, be part of the project of thinking about, can we build movement infrastructure that can hold not just leaders, but organizations together to move towards a shared strategy around liberation.
Thank you for that. And then we're going to come back to you talked a lot about what makes what could start to make an organization liberatory. We're going to get into the what isn't it at times. But before we do that, I want to introduce Blue, who is one of the co-founders at NC Block, a statewide alliance in North Carolina that is building Black power. So Blue, can you share with us, again, how you kind of got into it? What was some of the sparks that helped co-found and really started NC Block? And then what are the characteristics of this liberatory organizations that we've been talking about? And, what are some of the things that have made it not so much? And then before you get in, just want to let folks know if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring, and we're going to get into a discussion after Blue goes. So want to say, please put them in. Okay, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Chen and Yeti. Welcome. Hello. Hey, everybody on the panel. So I'm Blue Lewis. I'm the co-founder of the North Carolina Black Leadership and Organizing Collective, which is also known as NC Block. I started organizing at 16 with Critical Resistance in New York, with abolition as my primary goal, framework, and the thing that politicized me. When I graduated high school, I actually went to the first United States Social Forum in Atlanta, 2007. Shout out to Cindy. And it was the first time that I actually believed that another world was possible, and actually saw all of the people who actually were in a commitment to making it happen. And so when I came to North Carolina in 2013, kind of trying to find my bearings, I was repoliticized through education in the school, in the classroom with my students. And then after everything started happening off with Trayvon, and everything since that time, I was repoliticized in North Carolina, joined Ignite NC, and through a series of conversations that were led by Arundel Bird, who was at the time the director of Blueprint North Carolina, started to really think about what are the conditions that we need to shift for Black people, and what do we need to do as organizations, movements, grassroots, grass tops, and nonprofit who have resources? What kind of collaboration and deep alignment do we need to be inside of to make it possible? Block started off in a unique position because it was during time of political unrest in North Carolina, but we're always in that rapid response, like pushing back across the state. But what brought together the conversations with Black leaders like Beloved Community Center, Spirit House, APRI, was the unique possibility of like having an abundance of resource at the time to be able to think about these questions and solely focus on them. And so in 2015, we had a few statewide meetings in Durham and in Greensboro at the Beloved Community Center to really think about what is needed to shift the conditions for Black people to address anti-Black racism in North Carolina and throughout the country. And what do we need to do together, or what can we do together that we cannot do as our individual formations? Before that point, everybody had what they was doing in their lane, but it was not coordinated strategy, like Tunji just said, right? Like, no, folks were not really communicating and talking to each other because of the white supremacist culture of scarcity mindset. And right, trying to think that like it's either my way or nothing else. And so we really worked very hard to shift those mindsets to conditions to help build the relationships. In 2016, Block was born. And with a unique charge, because that's the time we also joined the movement for Black Lives. And sometimes I'm like, which things are informed what? Really to think about like, what is our collective strategy? How do we get as much feedback and buy-in from members and folks across the state? And how do we not push up against every moment of urgency, but use them as opportunities to politicize our folks, to bring our people in, and also to not create a one path, like you gotta come through movement through Black liberation. But I'm like, what about the people who love environmental justice, right? And so how do we actually build intersectional, Black-led, multiracial formations that are like committed to naming anti-Black racism as inconsistent with liberatory strategies? If you're not committed to naming your anti-Blackness, you can't be building liberation. And if you can't talk to your own people about it, then we need to really have some conversations. We also were committed to making sure that our strategies were in alignment with our members, which means that we took a long time to build our foundations and our structures, where folks were like, this is taking too long. And I'm like, yeah, but when you have buy-in from, 300, 400 members across the state of North Carolina in more than 15 counties, when we have 100 counties, like that takes time and intention and relationship building. And we need to be able to have feedback loops that allow folks to be inside of creating what is possible, so that vision drives what we produce, right? And sometimes as like the folks who get the unique and very great opportunity to be inside of these conversations, to think about liberatory strategy, to think about how we advance our people when other folks don't have that space and time. It is our duty as liberatory practitioners to be in deep relationships with folks on the ground. And we do not have a base of people, at least 10 folks, not even in our family. Like if you don't got 10 folks in your family who's helping you ground your decision making and how you think about strategy and liberation, then we really need to start thinking about like what we actually are, right? And like maybe capacity builders, but it's not liberatory formations. And so we do operate inside of a transformative organizing model and a translocal organizing model, which means that we take all of the visions and the strategies from across the state. We create spaces where our members and our partners can come and share key lessons. Like, so what's happening in Fayetteville is happening in Charlotte, but they can come together and really talk about the strategies and remix it and take it back to their states to just know that like, okay, we're not alone when we're in this fight. And so, yeah, okay, so that's what we do. I think in terms of, liberatory organizing, I think we have to be willing to be at the will of our people, honestly, and test alignment. Like a part of what I do in movement building is build infrastructure, get resources to our folks on the ground who usually get overlooked or overshadowed by folks with more resources. And so being inside of that is like building the infrastructure. Is it in alignment with what our people think, and how are we really clear that we are sometimes eons beyond where our folks are? And what are the things we're building right now to be able to move them and walk with them, right? Because our visions around liberatory, around freedom, around sovereignty, around abolition is our North Star that we're working towards. But if we're walking by ourselves and leaving our members and our folks behind, like when the shit come, folks are going to be like, who are these who? Who said that we want this type of liberation? And so I really do think it's important to be grounded, which does take relationships, which does take an actual practice of the values, principle, struggle, combating liberalism in our work. And it also requires us to like not practice white supremacy. We'd be like, white people, white supremacy doesn't have a culture, but it's like, it really does. Fears from white supremacy, thinking that you're the only one, or the right way is that having either or binary thinking, right? If we're all on the form, if we're all trying to move towards abolition and a just transition of this country, of our world, then let the reformers do their job. If we share the sniff style, let the direct actionists do their job, the base builders, everybody has a lane, and we can all play and be in right relationship if we have a shared vision. So that part is really, really important. Yeah, and we have to make space for our people to be people. To be like, I'm hurt. I don't want to actually be inside of a conversation on what we need to win when we're not even talking about like my neighbor who keeps stealing all of my stuff, right? And like, these are real things that we have to grapple with as both, well, that I have to grapple with as both a statewide formation who is in national formations, who is helping to lead and construct them, and also someone who is very accountable to all of the folks, organizations, and people on the ground. How do we do that in a symbiotic dance that allows for folks to show up in their fullness? Because if we don't build liberatory movements and structures that allow people to be in their wholeness, then we are at risk of creating something more harmful for our people when we win.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yes to all of that. So, okay. So each of you kind of touched on what it has either looked like, the current political moment, why we're doing from international, building it, and the necessity of liberatory organizations. I want to get into a little bit of the nitty gritty, right? So we know that historically there have been all kinds of political formations, and many of our organizations these days live in a certain tax status. We are all 501c3s. Many of us have had experience working in all kinds of nonprofit organizations, right? And I would love to know what makes the organization that you're currently at, that you help co-found, or that you are the lead of, a liberatory organization as opposed to just a standard nonprofit. Like, what are the policies? What are the practices? What do you do? What makes it feel different for you, but also for everyone you work with? I'm going to pass it to you first, Cindy, unless someone wants to jump in.
All right. Good question. You know, I think from the very start, I wanted to mention in the development of Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, I think there's a very, very important relationship between national formations and local base building organizations. And I think in this country and actually many parts around the world, but I think in this country and in the form that we choose, right, the legal form that we choose to do much of our organizing, which is the nonprofit model, is that there's a way in which also philanthropy works, right, and has had really damaging and problematic practices, which is it's easier to fund national formations than actual local base building formations, which I think, and I'm clear, I think we're all clear here, is that is where the work happens, right? That is where the site of struggle is. That is where the material changes in people's lives are. And that's the place of massively under-resourced and resourced in multiple ways, not just financially, happens, right? In terms of also like focus or highlighting or showing up as a real sort of model of transformation. So when GGJ got started, the membership that started GGJ was really clear that they didn't want a national formation that had a big headquarters, that had a big staff, that actually had that the lion's share of the resources being raised were going back out to the membership. And I think that's important to say because of this distrust of and bad practice of different national formations that have either co-opted the work, gained lion's share of the resources and build out the infrastructure with very little role and relationship, or much less accountability to the people on the ground that they say they're representing. And I say that very clearly because I think that there's ways in which we need to be able to talk about some of the places where I think where there are places of tension and division in our movement, and a history of not good practice. And so when GGJ got formed, it was very clear that, we were actually operating virtually from the very beginning. Many people in the pandemic got shell shocked into actually moving into a virtual way of organizing and communicating. But I think our work from the very beginning was that. And I think the intentional growth of staff and how we actually paid staff and what we were and the role of staff in relationship to member leadership was actually always very fundamentally clear, that we were not, the Alliance had to actually, there was a reverse, right? It's like we had to be in service and the leadership, and the Alliance would not be here 16 years later if it were not through the protagonism and leadership of our membership. We don't, we also, this is where we're not Alinskyites, we do actually value the role and leadership and agency of staff, and in a lot of ways think about ourselves, we are entrusted with that role and responsibility to carry out some of the tasks that our members then tell us that are necessary to do on a national or international level. And I think that that's also important, right? I think Blue spoke to this. It's like what is the interplay between the strategy of aggregating power, but not actual building empire of organizations or fiefdoms of organizations at a national level. And I think that piece is important. It's like, what's the role, what's the purpose of for example, a national alliance like Grassroots Global Justice? The second thing, so I think that's an important piece for us to deliberate on. And I think it's a place of like, it's necessary to have national formations, but towards what and for what, and in the service to whom, right? And I think that's one important piece. The second piece is around how it's like, for me, organizations serve a purpose, right? And I think we have to be clear on the objective. And many times I think that, organizations on a local level are the location where individuals come because they're dealing with an issue, right? Something is happening in their community. Either it's directly impacting them or their family or loved ones, or it's impacting the places they live, they work, they pray, right? And part of it is it's a place where usually people come in with an individual self-interest. And I think it's organizations are the place where people transform, right? And it goes from individual to collective articulation. And I think for me, organizations become like the necessary motor for campaigns, for collective action, for collective reflection, for strategizing, for implementing plans, for failure, and then for us to actually be able to adapt and also become a place of family, right? Of chosen family. It becomes a place of solidarity with each other and doing work with people, whether it's your coworkers or whether it's community members, or it's whether it's a specific constituency or an issue that you care about. And I think that part of that is super important for us to always recognize. It's like people come in because of some kind of heart assessment. They're like, I feel very strongly about this. And I think it's in the process of why organization is so important. And I believe the need for us, because on one level, we see the government isn't providing shit for people. And it's like often people come to organizations to meet that need, right? And part of that is mutual aid and providing services is absolutely important and necessary. But I think it's, again, the purpose of it. We're not just there to provide something and give something out of a charity model, but it's actually to actually get people meet their need, but almost capacitate that leader to deal with whatever they're dealing with But then to be able to be in a process of leadership, development, and transformation and agency. And I think if I were to think about the role of GGJ, we have done a lot of work around political and popular education and the need to be able to understand these systems of oppression and exploitation in a non-dogmatic way. The trips that we've taken when we've gone to internationally or nationally, or these exchanges with social movements and their counterparts, is around political exposure and transformation, but also for people to again begin to see themselves as political subjects, right? As people, which means that they are beginning to understand their strategic role, not only as an individual, but as a formation, but then also as a movement. And I think that that's when I think for me at GGJ is one of the most important things, one of the most important tasks, right, of the moment. And I will say this till I die, is that we need to continue to build and strengthen base building organizations that are militant, that are durable, that are porous, and that are politically clear. And because it serves many purposes. And when we talk about the path to power and when we talk about governance, organizations are the first place where people experiment with democracy, right? Real democracy. And I think many of our formations don't always allow that to happen in its truest form. And I think that's one of our challenges. But I think it's one of also the opportunities. If we start seeing this as opportunity to be like, this is where people get skills, get exposure, get practice with each other to be able to do these things. This is what then politically prepares us for basically the task at hand, which is providing alternative to this rotten, dirty, fucked up system.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy. I want to see Tingy or Blue, if y'all want to add any of your experience to that around like thinking about this nonprofit structure and the organizations or formations that y'all have built and like, yeah, what makes them different, right? What are the ways that we actually are living into our liberatory values in the structures and how we treat people in these spaces?
Yeah, so, Tingy, I'll be brief. So Block, we just made a decision to not move into a nonprofit status but to remain a political project until the end of our strategic plan, which is a 10-year plan that ends in 2025. We made that decision based off our capacities and like what it actually takes to run a nonprofit. And two, just the relationship that we as individuals come in when we're thinking we're working inside a nonprofit. The nonprofit industrial complex is a whole thing, and hierarchy is already embedded. It's so deeply entrenchedly embedded in it that it has to be an actual practice of unlearning. And so some of the things that we are in practice of and inside of Block is like a shared leadership model with shared like clear accountability structures, like these are the decisions that you are accountable for making and this is what you're accountable for leading, and then be inside of a practice of transparency and accountability when you're unable to do something, which means that we have to kill our ego, right? Or it's like undo this thing that we just have to get the thing done even when we're in pain instead of just naming it. Because when we don't show up inside of that, we have impact on our members and partners who then start to build a distrust, right, with us when we're not adhering to our words. And so how do we be boastful about that and practice it out loud so our members could also be inside of it, so they can communicate to us when they have limitations, how they're being raggedy, or the things that we need to be held accountable for if we're not operating inside of our values. I think another thing too is like practicing being principled. We talk about it a lot. I love it is a daily practice in your life and in your organization and your friendships. It's not just a political practice. And also it does take accountability. Like it just takes time. It requires people to be actually in tune with their own selves around how they're showing up and why, right? And even if you're not prepared to talk about it, just being principled and having a principled assessment on why something is happening. What are the values that like are dictating how you show up or feel about this thing, and how you can communicate that in a timely manner that doesn't cause conflict or rupture? Because when it doesn't go addressed, when we are inside of a liberalism and like just letting things go because of the nature of our friendships, or wanting to be conflict adverse, or for whatever other many reasons we show up as liberals, it disrupts our movements, it disrupts our work. Even if it's not in that moment, it comes out in a bigger way that then takes more capacity for us to clean up and to address. And I think one of the things I've been just recently thinking about is like the role of the radical flank, right? Like the formations and the organizations who are deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched inside of a radical vision, and what space that makes for the folks who are on the spectrum from reform to our vision. And how do we start to lead those conversations? But it also takes an invitation of assessment, right? To be like, here's all of the ways you are out of alignment. Are you willing to be in alignment? Are you willing to work towards it? Or are you just like, I'm good, right? And inside of this, what are we all willing to do? And when are we departing, right? Like, I can't get behind abolition, so I'm gonna depart when y'all say these things. Like, let us know so that we can be in right relationship with each other and know and have conversations. These things has also been some of the struggle we've been inside of being in partnership with nonprofits, when we're like, our members make decisions on our strategies. We have to ask them, so we cannot give this back to you in 24 hours unless it's real urgent matters, right? And people are like, well, we're just gonna move along, or like, we're still gonna ask our folks and give feedback even if you move along. And what that means for us to actually all be in a practice of that. Like, what does it mean for us to have a 1 week decision-making or 2 week decision-making culture, instead of it being rapid all the time, so that our folks have the time and space, and even our own selves, to like process, to give key lessons and feedback on things, so that way it's involved and not just a demand that is being pushed down on our people and even on ourselves as staff. And, you know, I think that like the centering joy, this is the last one, and wholeness. So whenever you walk into a block space, that's what we try to hope. We always have a healing space that is a part of your movement work, your contribution to this meeting space. If you have to be inside of that healing space the whole time and not engage in the political content because that's where you're starting, that is important. And we ground all of our work inside of like, what does it take to bring the whole person? What does it take to meet the needs that you need to meet right now to be inside of this political battle that we're in? And how do we slow down so that our members and our people can come with us?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, to slowing down sometimes, right? I know for me that's a little hard, and it's a lesson that, you know, I think can benefit all of us in that moment. So I saw you come off mute. Tindy, did you want to ask? Are you ready? Okay, go for it.
Also, it's so hard to follow Blue and then Cindy. So just saying a lot of love. And also every time everyone talks, I have something to say, and just even slowing down. I think there's so many things. And I was facilitating a meeting the other day, like joy, slowing down, that people treat as these like hyper individual experiences that actually don't have a strategic function. And I think we are because of what I shared earlier, we're actually in a political moment, and I've said this before, where it is causing a significant amount of fatigue and pessimism. And as a result of that, the consequence of that is to watch not just individuals, but leaders operating out of confusion and defeat and still working. And that's because out of fatigue, you don't always operate with clearest, your own clearest like assessment and strategy. And in the absence of joy, you actually are, you can fall into pessimism and defeat and cynicism, and then be in one way or the other subtly helping to advance the strategy of your enemy. And people do it all the time. And so, and I when I was facilitating a meeting last week or a couple of weeks ago, who knows what week it is, but I said, joy. If you are in a meeting with people day after day after day, and no joy lives there, perhaps frustration, tiredness, fatigue, anger, but joy, I'm not saying that we have to create where organizations are not always responsible for everyone's wellness, but we are responsible for understanding wellness as a significant function of someone being part of it and organizing practice. And so like there's a difference. And if we don't realize that joy and laughter and smiling and also rest is a serious requirement, then we'll continue to descend in a particular kind of way. But I actually have hope that we won't. I just want to say a couple things about what does it mean to build a liberatory organization. I feel like I respond to this question with great humility, because I think that we're always in practice. And what does it mean to build a liberatory organization is about the work that you all are about doing. What is it rooted in? And then second, how do you function? So I think those are like, we're always in practice about how is our work actually contributing to this like pretty daunting task, as Cindy is, of like actually undoing what harms, so we can actually realize liberation. That is something that we should always be in question about, because the truth is like, if we had all the answers, like, you know what I'm saying? So like, how are we always in question about how is my work contributing to the long arc of revolutionary change and liberation? And then second, how am I functioning in a way that contributes to sustainability and also engaging in some of the core functions like democratic practice that actually then also contributes to building organizations that contribute to liberation. And I think the one thing that we have to contend with is that we've seen a proliferation of NGO and organizations, whether it's fiscally sponsored NGOs, over the past several decades. And while that has like a lot of significant impact, I think we have to piece what are some of the trends that have come from this proliferation of the professionalization of movement work, and out of that, I think we have to, one of the things, and then I'll stop talking, is because someone talked about what was it, failure, or that we have liberatory organizations treat failures as powerful opportunities for sharpening and growth and being even more clear about what does it mean to be about the business of liberation. I think one thing, the tendency that we have to fight, and this is because of as a result of needing to get money and wanting an institution to feel and be powerful so that you can be legitimized, is that sometimes like one of the tendencies that I've noticed is this sort of telling stories of success about an organization that doesn't actually deal with structural change or reduce suffering, but does land for an audience that legitimizes you and contributes to your organization. I think that's one tendency of like, how do we actually be about the business of truth telling and use failure as an important opportunity for that. I have a whole lot of other stuff, but I'll stop there.
That is a perfect segue, because I have like 2 more questions before I'm going to get to some of the audience questions. I'm going to try to get quick and remind folks we have a couple of questions that have come from the audience. I'm going to be passing to those pretty soon. And then if there's more, we'd love to hear from y'all. So yeah, put them in the chat, put them in the question and answer. We're going to transition to that section next. So the next question is right on that line, Tinji, around failure, right? So I'd love to hear if y'all are willing to share, right? In this practice and experiment of building liberatory organizations, where have you failed and what has that taught you?
I can start. I've had a lot of failures.
Okay.
I mean, this is like also in the like infrastructure or coalitions or that I've worked with. I think like losing clarity of purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I think it's very easy to build around an idea and then and work to advance that idea and actually lose clarity of how do you arrive at purpose, and then how do you stay on purpose. And I do think what it takes is an assessment of the context and of the moment, and then a landscape of what it already exists, whether or not it's great, good, whatever, what already exists, and then clarity of like what is sort of the impact that I can make towards a landscape that's contributing to to shifting the context. And I think I have watched or been part of and also responsible for organizations trying to achieve the goal of everything and thinking that was revolutionary or liberatory or just. And sometimes it becomes moral. Like this is important, base building is important. So how are we engaging with the question of base building? When the truth is like many organizations should not be engaging in base building, or a number of different things. So I say that to say, it's like staying clarity on purpose, and then having the profound flexibility to evolve over time without losing sight of like what your purpose is, and if there is a need to change it or assess it, then assess it, but but I think it's around being, and then operating in confusion. And I think in moments like this, you lose people. And whether or not you clarify something or you don't clarify something, you have the potential of losing folks in your formation. The difference is that when you don't clarify, people leave out of confusion and frustration because they don't feel a purpose in their own soul.
Yeah.
As opposed to when you do clarify, people get to choose what they're part of, which is like a beautiful invitation. So I think that that's something that I've struggled with. I've had to challenge within my own organizing.
Thank you. Thank you for naming that, Tingy, and offering. Cindy or Blue, you all have an offering around a failure.
Oh yeah, all the time. No, I think in all seriousness, I think that this work of the process of building organization, of actually being so bold to think that there's actually an alternative, the process of actually trying to bring people together around different interests and different ways of seeing the world is really is hard. And I think we have to actually, it's like when you're knocking on doors and talking to people, you get a lot of doors slammed in your face, and it's like, and it's the process of going back and going back and going back that actually creates the possibility of that change, and I think I always tell that story when I'm training organizers. It's like, listen, Nora Calderon like slammed the door in my face like 5 times, and 30 years later, she's still a leader in the domestic worker organizing. And I think it's that process of actually saying, one, it's being able to be clear that we're going to have obstacles and bumps. And it's the clarity that I think Tenjiwe speaks about, that we have to have about where are we heading towards, right? And I think it's in the lack of understanding or having that kind of hypothesis. It's like we got to be kind of scientific about organizing. There's an art to it, but there's a science to it. And part of the science to organizing is that you have to actually have a hypothesis of what we're trying to actually do. And that would take, and that is going to be based on an assessment, or what we call a conjunctural analysis, right? It's a big word to basically mean like understanding our context and knowing our power and the power that we're fighting against, the power of our enemies. It's being able to do those assessments, right? And giving the space and time to do those assessments, but then developing a plan, a strategy to how to do that. And usually that takes the form of a campaign, that takes a form of a process, that takes a form of some level of series of actions. And it takes a form of actually identifying who you're going to do it with. Because it's also a misnomer that we do it ourselves, or our organization is going to do it on its own. And I think that it's absolutely necessary to build out all the different pieces, that all the different roles and allies and people that are needed to be able to get to then prove that hypothesis right or wrong, right? And so I think part of that, and then actually it's then getting into the joint practice, and then that's when all shit like sort of breaks loose, because then conditions are different, right? All of a sudden it's like the right comes after you and tries to slam you, right? Or different forces that we didn't understand or weren't clocking then actually take positions that are contrary to yours. Folks in elected office are actually not going to champion your cause. And so then that's where we have to be adaptive, and we have to actually kind of keep coming back to, how do we sort of go back to home base, which is organization, and then figure out how to then maneuver, right? How to maneuver and what makes sense, knowing what we then know at that particular moment. And then evaluating, right? And the importance of evaluation and the importance of summation and synthesis of political lessons, so that we can understand. And then like, what is it that we built? What relationships did we build? What level? So it's not just about like, did we win this thing? And how do we measure success, not just in the win, but how do we actually measure success even though we lost, right? And I think that that's super important. So I feel like, to me, I think that this piece around people's fear of sharing, shame. Let me actually not say shame of sharing that what they didn't or didn't what they did or didn't accomplish. We got to break that, y'all. Like we got to break that. And I think that we have to be able to share the lessons learned, right? And I think it's not monolithic. What happens here, I live also in North Carolina, what happens here in North Carolina is not going to be the same thing that happens in Puerto Rico, that happens in North Dakota, but there's some lessons that I think can be shared, that I think people can take when there is actually honesty and humility and actual ways of being able to be actually politically vulnerable. And I think that's what we need to shift into more of. And I think that drives the counter to then the competition or the sort of showcasing what Tenjiwe was talking about, like, hey, this is what we're doing and winning. And I was like, great, but who are you winning? What qualitative ways do we talk about wins, right? How do we then redefine what that means?
Thank you, Cindy. Yes, let's start. Cut the shame.
You can't be shameful for something you already have an assessment about. Okay, you gotta own it. So I think for me, I know for me, one of the biggest failures that I've been experiencing, even as of recent, is that, and I think Carissa Lewis said this, is that political relationships don't make a politic. And not being clear on what is the political impetus behind our relationship and how we're relating inside of movement, and how that is supported by our external relationships, whether it be personal as comrades or as lovers, and then the contradictions that come up as a result of those two things. And I think that, coupled with like trying to practice more openly, like cultures of interdependence and interconnectedness, where like it requires like me to say how I'm showing up, why I'm showing up, like I said earlier, and how it's impacting people, and for everybody to bring that, and we trust that that's what we're operating inside of. Some of my own conditioned tendencies has led to some of my failures around like continuing to do the work when nobody is showing up instead of naming it, right? And so now I'm like burnt out, and I'm inside of my own trauma response and showing up, and like just divesting so quickly that the bottom falls through, right? It's like, I can't do this anymore. Now people are seeing all of the holes, but it's so many of them that folks weren't aware of. And I think there's a couple of conditions that make that possible, or like create the conditions for folks to show up in that way, where like we are leaning so far on our personal relationships and not really considering and taking time to think about, like, is this professional political relationship working? Are we still actually in alignment with what we're set out to do? Or has our vision shifted on how we actually to meet that, and being clear around it and out loud? And sometimes that's even like organizations and formations we are in relationship with, in a coalition space, or like doing a project with them. And it's okay to be like, hey, we are no longer in right relationship based off of how you are showing up or how I am showing up. And we really need to have the intentional conversation around it. And sometimes people take that as in my experience, is like, you attacking me personally, but me. And it's like, I'm talking about your institution. And as a leader of the institution, you have some accountability to the work that we're doing. It's not about you, right? And sometimes it is personal, and sometimes it's weird to me, y'all, because it's like, some folks who work in the profession of movement building and organizing are no longer in the class, like the working class, like the financially, like, right? Like we have actually moved up, right? And we are actually operating inside of a different set of abundances, resources, access to people, places, things, and capital. And I feel like that tension has come up a lot, especially because I'm still like, working class person living in the hood with my neighbors, right? And so like thinking and coming up with talking about those contradictions from a political point, and having it land on people personally, is like, that's because we're not moving with the class analysis and assessment of how we're operating inside of this work and how it's impacting how we show up. And so that's one of my main failures. And then another one is like not being like, what folks have shared, like pushing out our narrative a lot more. when our people know who we are more protected from the state, right? When people are able to be like, I know Black, this is what they do. Anybody who counters what we do, they will have a narrative and a rebuttal for it. We don't need to be there to do that work. And like, how do we create that narrative? How do we share that more openly, transparently, and like, and conversations and connection with folks? Because it's like, here's my assessment of how we've messed up, what we could have done better, but like, let's hear how it actually landed on people. And being the protector of our folks and trying to absorb all of the wrong and then trying to fix it also protects people who are in the institutions that are causing the harm. And so while we're absorbing it and making sure that like we are here for our folks to listen, we're not also saying like, but these are the reasons why, right? For the sake of, I don't know. And so like, for us, I would want us to start naming those things out loud and consistent, because when everybody is in a practice of it, then it becomes culture and it becomes a norm. When it's one person, two people, three people who are speaking about it, they become adversaries to the vision of liberation and get pushed out, which means that there are people who their practice under don't actually have a way to engage and be on our leadership pipelines, to be in leadership, to take over our strategies and to keep our movements moving forward. When we are tapping out, who is left, right? And are we actually creating two different cultures? We're practicing in our organizations, but then when we send them to our other formations, they're like, what? Like, what? How are we prepping our people for those differences, but not creating like idealism too? Because I feel like sometimes when we talk about the new world in our work, it's like, this is what we're trying to work towards. And what we're not saying clearly is like, even if you're not here, we are like committed to taking you with us, right? Like we're not gonna, we're committed to being in struggle with you, or we're committed to your development, we're committed to moving and working with you as long as you are in a commitment to moving and learning, right? And so, you know, trying to name the vision has been really, really great, but it's also like the vision and our commitment to our people. Because sometimes people are like, what y'all capitalism? My baby need to know how to operate capitalism. How you anti-capitalism? And, you know, not to be like, oh my gosh, you like capitalism, so we can't talk with you. But it's about having the commitment to like be inside of that. And a lot of formations is if it's like, you're not on our politic, if you're not in alignment, if like you ain't with me, then it's a blow up and a rupture, and there's a disconnect. And that's happened even in some of our programmings where folks were really transparent and open about what they were sharing, and we're like, what? You know, and I'm like, well, we have to remember that. And sometimes that causes tension and, you know, creates like disheartening in our people, and they don't show back up and we lose them in that way. And so those are some of the ways that we failed. Listen, y'all, okay, don't hire your homies unless they are principled, okay?
I deeply thank y'all for really being vulnerable and sharing the failures and how we can continue to push and learn from them. So we have a couple questions. I want to make sure we have some time to get to. So one of the first ones is, what's the role of healing justice, right, within your organizations and then within even just transformative organizing, period? Yeah.
One of the top critical and important roles, and that there needs to be somebody in your formation to hold that intentionally. And not just as a byproduct of how we do our planning, but like how are we doing healing justice and restorative justice as an active practice, and putting resources, time, and intention and similar strategy development towards it as we do other practices. Yeah, it has to be there. Otherwise, it'll just become something that's done that we don't really like quantify or evaluate, or is something that we're missing and our people are hurt. Now we got all these people showing up and they hurt, and we're asking them to do risky things, and they can't actually make a grounded decision for their own selves because of the trauma that's inside of them. And so it has to be at the forefront.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll just jump in and I'm just thinking about like just really powerful leaders on the healing justice front, like Kara Page and some other folks. And for me, it's like, so, and also like from teachings from folks, healing justice is like a framework to deal with the sort of trauma and violence that is part of our everyday existence, but also like that has a long history and arc. And I think that there's a difference between being a healing justice organization and then an organization that has an analysis and framework around healing justice. And the reason why I say there's a difference is because I think that with organizations, we will always have to contend with like violence and trauma. And there are ways in which we have been conditioned to respond to violence and trauma that aren't rooted in a way to actually interrupt or confront it. And I think like how we have an analysis around that, so that in moments we're able to respond in ways that is informed by analysis, and to hold that, I think is between whether or not an organization will succeed and build power or not. And then there are healing justice organizations that have done the work of really building the capacity for us to be able to do healing justice work. And so that's sort of my quick response on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I want to add some nuance to this, because I know that I think it's actually torn some of our movements and some of our organizations apart. The question of like, what's the role and responsibility of an organization to deal with individuals' level of trauma and pain. And so I'm going to name it very clearly, that I do think that organizations, the way they're currently configured, are not equipped, and it's actually irresponsible for organizations if they're not equipped to deal with some of that, some of the things that come up for people individually. And I think that this is part of it, is that we have to have it in the context of an analysis of what the government and our communities and our institutions that are meant to provide that service and that support are actually not doing, right? So I think that's one thing. We have to have a systematic sort of analysis around the destruction of the mental health sort of infrastructure of this country from the 1980s on, in terms of actually how do we actually not have ways and mechanisms and institutions that actually, again, can be evolved on and built on and brought in from a racial justice, a feminist analysis around what healing and the healing justice and disability justice movement has actually fought for and demanded and sort of given and contextualized, right? And so I think that that's one piece that I think I just want to say, because I've seen organizations step up to the plate and actually fail, talking about failing and, failing miserably and actually very toxically because of not being able to deal with what has come up. I think many organizations are modeling now, and what you're talking about, Blue, is like they're modeling ways to build in infrastructure and people who actually have the skill set and the capacity to be able to deal, or a mechanism of how the organizing is done. You talked about Tenjiwe joy at meetings, it's like playing, joyfulness, building of relationships, the building of trust. You can't skip those steps, right? And oftentimes in our transactional model of organizing, that happens. But if you actually are trying to actually be transformative, you are going to take the time to build relationships. You are going to take the time to build in building. Like, for example, when we do multiracial building, it's not a given. Even within the pan-Latino, Latinx community, it's not a given that we're all going to get along or we're all going to come together and around all of this stuff. And so I just feel like it's the intentionality and it's the approach of how we organize and create mechanisms where people feel seen and people feel heard, and not in a transactional way. The third piece around it that I do want to say is that many people, and I think about this in my own development, politics did kind of save my life. Many people, many of us say that, right? It helped make sense of what I went through, what my family went through, what I continue to go through, right? And did I go to an organization to get healing? No. And so I think that part of it is like, where and how do we hold that nuance, right? How do we hold that nuance around how it is that being able to understand root cause issues, as my mama as an immigrant, my family as like, you know, poor, and all of the isms, me as a lesbian, all of these things, right? How do we actually understand our fullness and our wholeness and the necessity to not compartmentalize ourselves, even with our trauma, and to be able to also say where and how do we actually figure out that support and that mechanism, and then that the community of support and the mechanisms of how it is that we hold ourselves to ensuring our well-being, our collective well-being. So I think those are the things that, and you know, and I think we have learned at GGJ, like we just had our membership assembly, and we created a whole infrastructure as part of the assembly of a sacred art altar space, 10 healers that came, that were there and provided, and our people are in pain. And I think what Blue said is absolutely right. It's like people are dealing with such, in the context of the pandemic, in the context of the economic crisis, all of the shit that people are facing, and having spaces structurally to then deal with that, and having people who know how to hold these spaces and have been trained to deal with it and are politically aligned is so critical and important. And so I think there's models to this that I think we're really learning from. And again, this is coming back from the sharing of what's worked, and also the sharing of what hasn't worked. And then to be actually very clear of what we can and cannot give people, and be responsive to that.
Yeah. Just if I could jump in real quick, because I think that some of the things I feel important for me is like, how do we tease out having an analysis and framework of what healing justice means and the actual work of healing. And I feel like the separating of that is important, not to conflate, because essentially what we have to do is figure out, at the end of the day, the work of healing oneself is a project of oneself, and organizations cannot house the work of healing individuals. It can, however, create the conditions collectively to disrupt sort of norms or violent or et cetera, and contribute to actually people being like Cindy said, same for me. But it can't actually do the work, healing individuals. But an organization, in terms of having an analysis, can figure out, how am I contributing towards like a healing liberatory practice, or how am I not? Because in the absence of that, so what I'm talking about is like framework and analysis, not necessarily the execution of healing, although, you know, there's like complexities and nuances there. Yeah. And then the other thing I just want to also say, there's trauma, but there's also what happens when something happens in your organization. What happens when something happens at JC? Because so no matter what, you don't have to be part of a particular organization to know that we have to sharpen and develop an analysis and a study. Folks have like written, documented, being practice of studying it, because if not, then those things will not just be contradictions, they will undermine us from the inside. So like, and how do we also say organizations can't do the full work of healing individuals, but organizations can encourage that the healing as being an essential part of organizing and being in liberation work.
Yes, thank y'all.
I was like, Lord, you got, but this one got you. I was like, this one's good. But I think that and I think you said it, Blue, earlier, there's a difference then in the last point that you made, Tenjiwe, around sort of like when there's harm done within organizations, that is very different. So I just also want to delineate that, because I think that there is a process of like, actually, you said combating liberalism, right? Is sort of like being conflict avoidant, trying to protect, trying to sort of like be, you know, sort of veil what's actually going on. And I think that there is something about actually being in constructive, productive criticism that is actually important, you all, that there is conflict that sharpens us, but it's the way, I think we don't always have the tools to how to articulate difference. And I think we say this time and time again, difference is actually good and okay, it's oftentimes we're not equipped or we don't have models that show us how to be able to be in difference with each other and still at the end of the day go on a walk or go for a drink together, and I think that's the skill set that we have to sharpen this next phase, because if we're in the work of trying to actually transform society, not only from individually to the whole damn thing, then we have to deal with contradiction. And I think navigating contradiction is sometimes the hardest thing, because it goes against, like you said, Blue, sometimes our members say some whack ass shit, homophobic shit, say racist shit. And you're just like, okay, do you block them out, or do you like check them right there in public and shame them? Or do you actually say, Miss so-and-so, or brother or sister or kinfolk, let's have a conversation, or let's be part of a political education process, or let's actually have an exposure to actually learn to to actually do that. And I think that is the role of organizers. That is the role of transformative organizing, is that we take people where they're at, because we have to understand we're so embedded in this system, right? So embedded in fundamentalisms and nationalism and all these things. And so people aren't always going to say the right thing. In fact, they're always probably going to say the wrong thing. And it's the process of development. And if we believe in human development, then we believe in people's ability to transform. And I think that in abolition, if we are saying that we want prisons to be done, it's like, I've been, many of us have been impacted by sexual violence, by domestic violence. And it's like, if we believe in abolition, we say it is possible for people to transform. It may not take 5 years, next 10 years, it may take the next 100 or 250 years, but that's the kind of process that where we need to understand that that's the role of a conscious organizer, right? And that's that we have to hold those contradictions, and it's okay to vent, and it's okay to say, man, that's fucked up, or I'm disappointed, or I'm really upset, or I feel offended. That doesn't negate that you don't have a response or that we're robots. It's just more about, it's like, what's the mechanism in place for us to then deal with those contradictions that organizations have to actually be very explicit about.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I have two, I'm going to try to get through. I have two quick questions. They will require 30-second responses. I'm just gonna say it now. We're gonna try a thing. So one is, and this one is from Beth. So they're looking for resources and organizations. What are places where people can join that if they don't feel a part of movement, right? Is there an organization? Is there something that they can bring people into? That is our first question. I'm gonna start there, and then we'll close out with our last question. So if you have one, you have a couple resources and places that people can join movement, where should they go?
I was like, listen, I'll do that. There are so many organizations on the local level, on the state-based level, I think it depends, like what moves your heart. It's like, where is it that you feel like you want to contribute, what aligns with your politics and values. And there is plenty of organizations to help build and strengthen. And so I think, yeah, from your workplace, whether, it's like to your place where you pray, or places where you work, where you live, so I just think that there's so many. So sorry, I can't be specific.
Thank you.
I'm like, where you at? I can maybe give you a list based on where you at. And I think too, like, sometimes we don't have to join something, we can make something too, there's plenty of books, like book clubs, just joy events, or talking about the state of like our country on a consistent basis that could help to create a framework and a place for you and your folks in your community to be politicized, even if you don't know of an actual organization. It's just like, who else want to be inside of this? Googling, what are the top 10 books on, this thing that I really care about that we can introduce people to?
Thank you. Okay, and then because both of them, all of them are also very humble. So we have large alliances from Grassroots Global Justice to that Movement for Black Lives, that if you go to their websites, they list a bunch of their local organizations and members. Because we're not sure where you are, that could also be a really good place to start, right? So just want to name that. And then our last question is, and this one is for everyone, if you had one piece of advice that you would give to our audience members or people that they might be in conversation with next around, what does it take to sustain and build liberatory organizations? What's one piece of advice? Thanks, Blaine.
One, it takes time. And we need to be in practice of ease and release in order to be inside of this long-term strategy. Two, I love a nature analogy. And I think we need to know it and what part of the tree cycle we are picking up in terms of our strategy. Like, is the work we're doing tilling the soil and preparing for the work to pop off? Are we baby seedlings that need to be nurtured, right? Or are we like young trees that got some fruit on them? They may be tart, they may not all be edible, but they're good lessons for how we can grow abundantly. Or are we like big trees that got mad fruit, right, that need some amendments to our soil so that we can continue to thrive? Really having an assessment on where we are starting, because then it allows us to be deeply inside of what we're possible to create, and how far our strategies are going to get us, right, before we give it off to someone else. And the last thing I would say, I know this is more, but be in practice of not having your political work be your full identity, right?
Ooh.
Like, cultivate hobbies outside of this work. Like, for me, I love Black people. I love Black liberation. I love thinking about Black sovereignty. I am blessed that I get to wake up every day and be inside of this, but it is also not the fullness of who I am. And if I leave movement work, there are other parts of my identity and my life that I can cultivate that can catch me and hold me while I recuperate. And so that is one, if you don't take nothing else away, cultivate your identities outside of this movement work, child, because it's good for your mental health and it'll help you be able to have a grounded assessment that's not situated inside of urgency and meeting your own needs daily.
Thank you. Yes.
Right on. I fully agree with what Blue just said. I think 3 points. One, I think we cannot sustain the work of transformation without organization. But I think it's not any organization. And in fact, I think there's too many organizations. And I think this is a moment in which we actually need to cohere, we need to potentially merge. And some organizations, quite frankly, don't need to exist anymore. And so I feel like, to me, it's about being very deliberate and intention. I think we do live in a finite planet. And I think the conditions that our people face are going to worsen in this next period. And I think part of the question is, how are we actually being clear and strategic about our time and clarity of purpose? The third piece is around, be clear about the politics and the practice you inherit. So be curious and I think part of this is being able to actually understand the political tendency, the ideological influence your practice comes from, right? And I think that's super important for people to know, because many of us, I started talking about Alinsky, majority of us are very influenced by the Alinsky model of organizing. I have a total critique of it. There's many things of it that I think are the basis of actually training good organizers. But when we talk about a transformative organizing model, a liberatory model of organizing, a revolutionary model of organizing, we got to be clear about what it is, what it isn't, and be clear about coming back to, it's if our focus is liberation, there are ways in which we're going to have to engage in counter-hegemonic demands. We have to talk about building united fronts. We have to build with people we don't like. We have to actually show leadership in moments where it's taking huge risks, right? We're going to have to make concessions. And I think those are the kind of things we're going to be in a lot of contradiction, y'all. And part of it is understanding is where and how you make those choices. And then how your organization is a place where you deliberate, you collectively think, you collectively plan, and you collectively act.
Thanks. And Tenji?
Sure, I'll try. I'm going to be short by just saying like yes, 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 yes to what the comrade said. I think building organizations is a lot for me. Is a lot about the project of rejecting hyper individualism. That I think is a byproduct of a lot of things, but one of them is like neoliberalism has impacted sort of not just like economic policy, but how we relate as people to each other. And collectivism is like an important feature, and building organization plays a role in that. One is like nuance, multiple truths, and complexity. I think moving away, like collectivism forces us into moving towards complexity. So things aren't always about how I feel about a thing in a moment, but what is my assessment of a very complex context? And then what is a strategy rooted in that? So it's not rooted in how I feel. Your feelings are important. We have to hold the feelings of people, but feelings of individuals cannot be centered in strategy development. Second is humility. Like I always say, humility is like the most powerful tool of all of us. And I think it's tied towards like hyper individualism and ego. Like the most powerful tools of an organizer is their ability to move with humility and understand that we're always learning. Other is study. And I think that we talk about anti-intellectualism, but really what people are rejecting is sort of a particular model that's rooted in the academy of what it means to know a thing, learn a thing and know a thing. That has like contributed to a lot, but that's not what we mean by study, or it is like about building a culture of like of learning, growing, asking questions, experimenting, and then becoming sharper. The last piece is like we have to believe that we can win. I think that we are in the midst of a lot. We have been, but I think subtly as a result of a lot of different factors, which I won't get into, I think there's become an organizing character that is about harm mitigation, but actually doesn't believe in the possibility of victory. And that has subtle ramifications in how we develop strategy, how we engage with people, and then how we hold organizations. So we actually have to build organizations as if we are part of this destiny of winning and like of victory. And so that the bones and the DNA and the fabric of what we build and how we build it is ingrained throughout all of that.
Yes, 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 yes to all of it. So I am deeply honored. I am really excited to have been here with y'all. My mind is swirling with all of the things. I know that the practice, and from personal experience, the practice of trying to create and build organization from scratch is both inspiring and difficult. You are not handed a book, or if you are, it's not the book you want. Right? So how do we create these organizations, these formations that are going to allow us to create collectively the world we want, right? That is our task. And it will require both deep political education from all of us, the increased amount of joy and rest, but also the truth telling, right? That was named so many times from this group of how do we share both our lessons and our failures, and not just the successes and fall into the philanthropic trap of saying everything is great. But if we're able to do some of those, hold that and hold our people, we can get closer to liberation, right? So thank you, Cindy, thank you, Tenjiwe, thank you, Blue. I'm really honored. And I'm gonna pass it back to you, Kai.
Whew, we gotta take a second to exhale. I told y'all it was gonna be some fire up in here. I know you wasn't really ready. I know you didn't truly believe me, but now you know. And this is just like a small piece of what we're bringing for the rest of this conference. It started off fire, and we're gonna end fire. So I hope that you're enjoying yourself. Right now, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to break into 2 sessions, right? So those sessions that are coming up are how to go from values to policy to practice, and we can't fail. The future rests on our shoulders, right? So there's 2 sessions that you get to break into. You're going to choose one. Don't fret. Pick the one that you're most juiced to see today, and then later on you can log back in and see the one. It'll be you'll be allowed to view it in our pre-recorded sessions. All right, so you can view that at another time. I want to give it up to these wonderful panelists and our moderator. It was fire. You have got us juiced and energized for liberation, and we in this thing. All right, thank you so much. See you soon.
Bye, everyone.